Essentially what I'll do is talk as best I can around some pictures here. The topic, the coming of the Creek War, was a real tough one to come up with imagery, because most of the interesting images that I had available to me really are either way earlier, but way back in the colonial period, or and moving forward. So this period of 1800 to 1813 or so is pretty illustration poor. So what I've resorted to is a series of maps, and hopefully we can kind of work our way through the various kinds of social issues, population changes that were going on during that run up to the Creek War. So start out with this map. Oh, I guess I should also preface that what I'll really be focusing on today to a large extent is the origins of the Federal Road, which ties in quite closely with the origins of the Creek War and early settlement in Alabama. And mainly the reason I kind of settled on that was that we have a grant from the Department of Transportation to do an archaeological survey of the Federal Road in Alabama from Fort Mitchell in Russell County, kind of ran south of here and then headed down to the southwest and ended up at Fort Stoddard, which is in modern-day Mount Vernon, just north of Mobile. And the creation of the road, the kind of the various political machinations that led to the ability for the federal government to build a road through the Creek Nation was, of course, a major source of irritation to the Creeks, but also some source of opportunity for some of the Creeks who were more inclined to become assimilated into American society. So the Federal Road really is a nice way to kind of look at all the issues involved leading to the Creek War. This map is the first federal postal route map produced in the United States, dates to 1796. And of course you can't see the detail over there but on this, but on the lower right there is a little mileage chart. Basically it kind of gives you distances between various sorts of postal post offices throughout the east, and they are entirely all on the eastern seaboard. They didn't extend very far inland at all back in 1796 when the Postal Service was just getting underway. And our area of interest, of course, is this region, which at that time was considered part of Georgia. It's heavily populated, but by Indians. Very few American citizens living in this region. Florida was still entirely in Spanish hands, and Florida extended all the way to the Mississippi River, where it abutted Spanish Louisiana. So this is before the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. A lot of Spanish activity on the Gulf and to the west on the Mississippi River. And of course the British up in Canada. So it's a very different map than we see just a very few years later at the end of the War of 1812. A lot of these details had changed, and the American influence was much greater by that time. Here's the close-up of the region of interest primarily to us, which would include Alabama in the middle there. And it's an area with, as I said, many different Indian groups living here. There are Seminoles already, primarily in the Panhandle in northern Florida. These are an offshoot of the Creeks themselves, some Creeks who had moved down there pretty much from the American Revolution, or just before the American Revolution onwards, kind of a drifting migration down into this region. The Creeks primarily focused in the upper Creeks, rather, in the Coosa, Tallapoosa valleys and upper Alabama River area, and the lower Creeks, which are not even shown on here at all, basically over in the Chattahoochee. And Choctaws throughout what's today central Mississippi, Chickasaws in northeastern Mississippi, and Cherokees up in this region, and other groups kind of wandering through. There are many other peoples involved here besides the big seed names. The Creeks, Choctaws, Cherokees, Creeks are the most famous, but many other small groups kind of wandering about, affiliating with one group or another, bigger groups through time. So that's kind of the general situation. In 1796, there were really very few whites and blacks living in modern-day Alabama. They primarily would have been clustered just north of Mobile Bay, up in the upper reaches of the Mobile-Tensaw Delta, where colonists from the French period onwards had settled and built plantations and brought in African slaves, some of whom became free people of color and stayed on in their own right, and also a lot of intermarriage with Indians. And so this was a very ethnically mixed region, and probably, I think, in 1796 would be by far the most populous area of colonization. If you can think of American history as not just the march forward of the kind of the federal government and white settlers bringing African slaves is much more complicated than that. There were lots of earlier colonial areas of occupation that were absorbed by the American expansion to the west. Well, one of the changes that occurred in 1799 was the establishment of Mississippi Territory, which I'll show you in a moment, and the kind of readjustment of that southern boundary with Spanish Florida. The Spanish and Americans had thought that the boundary was considerably north of where it turned out to be when they actually surveyed it on the ground. So in 1799, the Spanish abandoned a pretty major fort they had at St. Stephen's, and because it turned out to be an American territory. And when they moved their troops down to Mobile, the Americans moved in and built Fort Stoddard at Mount Vernon, which is just above the new boundary line. And as far as I know, this is the first newspaper that was ever published in what would become the state of Alabama. It was published at Fort Stoddard. The Mobile Sentinel, published in 1811. This was the major point of American control for this region of the Mississippi Territory. The federal judge was there, Harry Tolman, quite famous from that early period. The major federal military post was at Fort Stoddard, and so on. So this became really a major center for trade and other kinds of things. It also became a customs duty collection point for trade up the Alabama River into the American-held parts of Mississippi Territory. So this is what it looks like just after 1799, a fairly subtle change. You have a boundary here with Georgia that becomes established, and the separate Mississippi Territory is then established. And you still see at this point that this region on the coast is still in Spanish control, part of Florida. It's not tremendously different. Well, this is a revision then in 1812 of that 1796 map, the postal map again. And for our purposes, the main addition to it is the creation of the Federal Road, which ran right through here. So I'll show you a close-up of that. This is a really extraordinary map, incredibly rare. It came up for sale a few months ago on a place out in San Diego, so I stole the image off the internet, like most people do, and here you have it. So it was either that or spend $100,000, which I didn't have. So. But anyway, this is the Federal Road as it's shown on that map, just the Alabama section. There is a big chunk of the Federal Road in Georgia, but who cares about that, right? We're in Alabama, and that's my focus for the grant, so we were kind of ignoring that part of it. Somebody else can tackle that. But anyway, this is the route, and there are alternative routes shown, at least in this section. This is a major problem we're trying to deal with. But anyway, this is what I'll be kind of commenting on throughout here. The reason this road was built was primarily because in 1803, when Thomas Jefferson pushed through the Louisiana Purchase, America acquired New Orleans, a major population center and a major port on the Gulf, and of great strategic importance to the United States. And immediately the government realized they needed to be able to resupply and just maintain communications with New Orleans and the rest of the country. And so the planning began and negotiations began for creation of a land route rather than depending on just sea travel. And it really wasn't until 1805 when the real opportunity arose, when the U.S. government began renegotiating treaties with all the southeastern tribes. And there was treaty negotiations with the Choctaws and Chickasaws and the Creeks. And one major part of the Creek Treaty allowed the American government to have a route that they would use primarily for postal service and for movement of troops if needed through the Creek Nation. So kind of to reorient here with the areas of settlement, this is still the boundary here between Spanish Florida and the American Mississippi Territory. Here's that settlement of old colonists, a lot of old Tories, people who had fought against the Patriots, the Whigs in the American Revolution, and had fled after their property was confiscated in Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina. So these are pretty virulently anti-American colonists down here, these folks, intermarried with Indians in many cases, and also holding many black slaves. So big populations kind of scattered through this area. There was a boundary, though, between the Indian nations and the American settlement, which is not shown in very many maps. It's kind of was a fiction that America actually controlled this huge area they called Mississippi Territory. The boundary actually ran kind of through the middle of Clark County here, and this would be Choctaw land on one side. Eventually the American settlements pick up over here, and the boundary continues down and then crosses at just above Fort Mims. And so this was all Creek country. This whole region here was part of the Creek Nation. And so the road mainly ran through Indian lands. It was not an area where Americans could expect to settle anytime soon. And they were expected actually to move along pretty rapidly along that route. The people who controlled American access on the Federal Road were primarily the military down here at Fort Stoddard, which is right here. And well, off the map in Georgia was the Indian agent for the Creek Nation, Benjamin Hawkins, and he issued passports, which many of which still survive today, and they're really interesting documents. They would allow individuals, named individuals with their families or business partners to come into the Creek Nation for some purpose, but not to linger and certainly not to settle. So it was just a kind of a passport for transit along the Federal Road. Okay, so where are we now? We're up to 1814. This is actually after the war, but it does show some changes that occurred just prior to the Creek War. In 1813, actually in 1810, the Americans who were living in this region, which had become, by this point, by 1810, this was the major area of American settlement. Not the old Tories over here, but these are new settlers coming into the Natchez region. And there were many thousands of people who came down the Federal Road prior to the Creek War and were heading primarily to Natchez. This is kind of an unexpected development, I think, on the part of the American government. They built the road for other purposes, but it was used to eventually to funnel settlers into the Natchez area. So this is a very large population by 1810, and they become increasingly disgruntled with the fact that they can't get past the Spanish control of the coast down here to trade their goods out into the Gulf and beyond. So a group of them in 1810, basically they're filibusters. They just march into this region of what are called the Florida parishes of Louisiana. They're called it because it was part of West Florida originally, and they seize those 6 parishes in that area, and basically just take them away from the Spanish. And the Spanish don't contest it. There was apparently some kind of diplomatic funny business going on between the French and the Americans and the Spanish. In 1803, when the French sold the Louisiana Purchase to the Americans, the American impression apparently was, according to Madison and other people involved, was that this coastal area would be included. And so even though it was Spanish territory, as Louisiana was actually held by the Spanish, the French were selling it out from under them. And the Spanish didn't agree with that part of it. So they contested this region. And so it was kind of a piecemeal acquisition through time by the Americans of this area. Early in 1813, then, before the Creek War broke out, but during the War of 1812, so Americans already fighting the British at this time, the American Army under General Wilkinson marches in and seizes Mobile, and at that point then everything from the Pearl River to the Perdido River over here becomes American territory, again just by seizure. They didn't worry about treaties or anything at that point, and because of the fact that there was a war going on, it was never actually reversed, although the Treaty of Ghent at the end of the War of 1812 probably should have reversed that part of it. So all very complicated. But eventually what we have now is free American access both down the Mississippi River and down the Alabama system into the Gulf of Mexico from 1813 onwards. So that's kind of the situation from the American perspective. The only other big settlement, and it was actually not very big at all, was Huntsville. Had been founded up here earlier in that decade, and so very isolated settlement, much more closely associated with Tennessee than the Natchez area or the Mobile area was. And there were a few other Americans, traders, mainly living with the Indians in here, but population is very small. We're talking about a few thousand American citizens in this area. All right, so that's kind of the general situation. We have here to kind of summarize the Federal Road, just roughly where it went. It crossed the river at Fort Mims. Samuel Mims actually probably became wealthy mainly because of the Federal Road. He had been a settler in that region since 1797, but really became very wealthy because he was one of the first to set up a ferry, and he charged, I think, $1 per wagon or some such amount, which is pretty steep back then. And because of the federal traffic of troops in particular, plus all the settlers going to Natchez, he became very economically well off. And so he had a big plantation in that area. And right before the Creek War broke out, because he had one of the largest houses and I guess he just simply offered, we don't know exactly what happened, but he seems to have offered his neighbors, which included both American settlers and their slaves and his neighbors, the Creek Indians in that region, to come there to take protection until the Indian scare blew over, which of course it didn't, but that was what his story was about. There were lots of other trails in this area. We don't know very much about them, unfortunately, but a couple of them are very important. One is the Wolf Trail, which is only mentioned a few times in documents shown on relatively few maps. But down here, at least, it follows Highway 29 pretty closely. It runs down the Escambia River and was a major part of the trade system that the Creek Indians used to reach Pensacola, which Pensacola and Mobile during earlier colonial times were the major locations where Indians could trade with Europeans if they wanted to go direct to the source. There were stores in both towns that the Indians could visit and purchase all kinds of goods. They'd usually exchange things like deer skins and furs and other forest products for all kinds of manufactured goods made mostly in England. Even though this was Spanish territory, it's mostly English merchants down in this region. So that trail got a lot of traffic, probably more actually than this one did in this section. These roads, the federal road is simply following, most of its length is simply following an earlier Indian trail. And they're very typically found on the ridges between drainages. You can see that this road generally falls between drainages that run to the east and west. So it's on the high ridge overlooking both drainages. And they only would cross a river when they absolutely needed to, because it's always a dangerous thing to do without a bridge or a ferry. So that's why these trails are located where they are. There's another one that's even less well known, the Tuckabachie Path, which leads to the Indian town of Tuckabachie up here, which is near modern-day Tallahassee. And it was also a pretty important trade route at different periods. And there were many more. We just don't know about too many in any detail enough to map them. All right, so we come up to 1813, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Indian perspective here. Even though I don't have very many images, we'll just linger on Josiah Francis here, the Alabama prophet. But he's a good representative of the people among the Creeks who were very disgruntled with the Americans and the American treatment of the Creek Indians and Southeastern Indians in general. There were a group of Southeastern Indians, such as the Indians around the Tensaw, the Creeks who had moved down near Mobile. These were people who were mostly the offspring of white traders and Indian women. And because of the nature of Indian society, which is matrilineal, because their mothers were Indians, they were considered parts of the Creek Nation as well. So these traders had kind of dual nationalities. They were either Americans or British or Spanish nationals, but then also members of the Creek Nation. And so that was one group that had some economic advantages. When their children grew up, they inherited often wealth from their father as well as their mother, which was a great advantage among the Creeks. And also because they were living down there, speaking probably many different European languages as well as Indian languages, they had all kinds of advantages in trading and dealing and negotiating diplomatically with the Europeans and with the Americans. So they became very wealthy as well. They also tended to buy slaves, have big plantations, and kind of emulate European and American sorts of plantation economies. Well, most of the rest of the Indians in the interior of the Southeast didn't have those options or didn't want to pursue that kind of assimilation route. And they were quite content actually to be Indians and thought their lifestyle was quite nice. They didn't have any real impetus to try to change their way of life. Even though the Americans throughout this period from 1798 or 99 onwards tried strenuously to encourage this assimilation process. The Americans actually institutionalized it in a policy they called the Policy of Civilization or Plan of Civilization. And the name itself indicates it's kind of a loaded term. You know, the Indians thought they were already pretty civilized, and the Americans didn't, essentially was what it broke down to. The main motivation really for the Americans, this includes President Washington and Henry Knox, is Secretary of the Army. They were both kind of together apparently melded this policy out. But it was accepted in by all successive presidents. Jefferson was a big fan of the Plan of Civilization. And the idea was twofold. I think they were really, deep down, I think they had good intentions with this. They saw that previous centuries of American expansion along the coast of the Atlantic coast area had really devastated the Indians in that region. The Indians had been pushed out of almost all their land. The ones that were left largely were living in extreme poverty, had no real means of supporting themselves except hunting occasionally, and just were not doing very well at all. Their numbers had dwindled dramatically. And so Jefferson in particular was very aware of that because of his historical research that he had done in Virginia. And so generally the American government's idea was that there might be a different way to go about this. None of them had any doubt that they should take all the land that the Indians could possibly give up. It was very much a land grab from the very beginning. But the benevolent part of it, and benevolence was a key term in their political philosophy back then. They thought that they should treat people well while getting what they wanted. And the way they thought they could accomplish this was to, if you could assimilate the Indians, make them part of American society, and basically make them disappear as Indians, the problem is gone. You have, instead of people running around over vast tracts of land hunting, if you could convert them to a farming way of life, they would use much less land per person, and that would free up lots of land for American settlers. So on paper it sounded like a great idea. The big obstacle was that most Indians didn't want to participate in that plan, no matter what the incentives given by the American government officials, like Benjamin Hawkins. And so he had relatively few takers on his plan of civilization. Most of the people that did participate in it were the ones down in the Tensas, Mobile Delta region, and some on the Georgia side of the line. There was some over there as well. So you end up with this big schism. One thing I should mention real quickly, if I have time here, is that there's a gender issue as well, which is kind of interesting. By asking the Indians to give up most of their hunting and devote all their energies to farming in a kind of a European style of farming involving plows, and in many cases they were thinking in terms of slave labor to run big plantations. What they were really asking the Indians to do, the Indian men in particular, was to stop being Indian men and become Indian women. Because prior to this time, Indian women had been the farmers. And this is a long tradition going back probably several thousand years, actually. We know from 1000 AD onwards, the women were full-time, very proficient farmers. And with some help from the men to clear fields, it was mostly women's activity. And the men that did other things to contribute, but they didn't participate in farming very much. The plan of civilization also called for changes in women's behaviors too. And since they were farming, what Americans were asking them to do was stop farming and become people who spun and wove cloth and did things that like American women settlers were doing. And so this assimilation idea wasn't at all simple for the Indians to accept. And most of them thought that not only was it a bad idea, it emasculated the men, it did all kinds of other things that were just really distasteful to many of them. And it also involved changes in religion and other things that we don't know very much about, but they were certainly part of it as well. So there were a big faction of Indians then, such as one of their leaders here, Josiah Francis, who Francis himself was part French. He was mixed ethnicity, as were many of the other anti-American faction at that period. And I guess what really coalesced them into a unified group that could actually resist American assimilation was a shift in religious beliefs. Early in the 1800s, about 1808 or 1808 or 9, there was a new religious development in the eastern tribes, mainly focusing on the Shawnees. It's often called the, well, Tecumseh is the most famous individual involved, but his brother Tenskwatawa was known as the Shawnee prophet, and he was the one that had some visions at this period of how to deal with the Americans, essentially, in a way that was appropriate to his religious beliefs. And what they were doing was kind of reaching way back into their earlier period when they were trying to remember how things had functioned before the appearance of whites, basically. And they didn't have any written records to do that, but they did have lots of traditions about how things had gone on before. So they kind of reconstructed, and I'm sure it wasn't this kind of objective sort of thing. I think it was a very emotional, religious experience that they felt. But what they came up with was a way to justify doing away with most of what they had accepted from the Europeans, from the traders that they'd known for centuries, and from these new American settlers moving down the Federal Road. They wouldn't accept the plow. They would try to get rid of all the domesticated animals that had kind of moved into the Creek Nation and other parts of the Southeast. They do away with as much European kind of technology, all the metals and things that they were having to buy rather than make themselves, and try to go back to a more self-sufficient sort of economy that fitted better with their image of what Indians should be doing in this world. So that's kind of in a nutshell, I think, what Josiah Francis was preaching. He actually went to visit the Shawnee prophet along with many other Creeks, and they sat at the prophet's feet and they learned this new religious teachings, and then came back and spread the religion among the Creeks. This new faction called themselves the Red Sticks because they were very militaristic, and the Red Stick was was a war club, basically, type of weapon that they adopted as their own. It wasn't a gun and it wasn't a knife. It was what they thought was a more traditional kind of Indian weapon. And so by 1813, this very militaristic faction was right on the verge of a civil war. Actually, it did break out during the summer of 1813 with the Creeks, who weren't so sure that this was the right way to go. There were a lot of people who thought they should try to accommodate the American push toward civilization, and were doing their best to get along with the Americans, and the Red Sticks then opposing them very, very violently. We just learned fairly recently here, well, one thing, I should back up a second. This kind of reaction to the European presence is called a revitalization movement by anthropologists. It's been recognized for about 50 years now as a kind of a fairly normal, very common response to change that's just out of control. It's out of your own control, and in fact, I kind of think we're going through a revitalization in the United States at this moment, but it's a kind of thing that has been seen in many parts of the world as European colonization really became very oppressive to many native peoples throughout the world. And so it's not at all a unique kind of situation. What we're just learning now, though, is that this response also dates way back into the prehistoric period. We think it goes well back into earlier times, and it's probably not the first time that the Creek people had a revitalization. One of the first things they did when they decided to finally go to war with their own people who weren't willing to accept this revitalization idea was to kill the chiefs. That was their main target initially. And the reason they did that was that the chiefs were the ones who had negotiated treaties like the 1805 treaty that allowed the Federal Road to be built at all, and later kinds of negotiations that the Creeks thought were really just setting them up for losing their lands and changing their way of life. And so the chiefs became the target. They'd been co-opted by the Americans, and most of them weren't willing to go along with the Red Stick movement. Some did, but most weren't. And so they were the target initially. And it led to several pitched battles, but it also led to kind of a breaking apart of the Creek people. Many of those who followed the Red Stick leaders stayed in the area of what's Alabama today, and many others who were opposed to them fled into Georgia. And so there's this big shift right at the kind of late summer of 1813. Let's see what else we got. Oh, here. One thing that of course contributed to all this was the arrival in 1811, 1812 of Tecumseh, who's the brother of the Shawnee prophet. He came south to try to find allies and converts. He was there's kind of been a portrayal of Tecumseh as primarily a war leader, with his brother being mainly the religious leader. But historians have been rethinking that, and it looks like Tecumseh was as much a religious leader as his brother. And certainly that was his role in the South, was not only to negotiate military alliances against the Americans, but also to try to promote the new religion. And certainly one natural event that really played into the hands of the Shawnees and the Red Sticks was this big, impressive earthquake of 1811-12, this whole series of massive earthquakes, which are the biggest known in historic times in the eastern United States. If they happened today at that scale, we'd have just incredible devastation of a lot of cities in the east today. But it was pretty sparsely settled, except by Indians, and so we don't have too many accounts of damage or loss of life. But it was a very impressive thing, apparently, to live through. And after kind of following in the footsteps of Tecumseh's teachings to the Creek people, it did produce a lot of converts. Also produced a lot of converts among the Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians living in the Natchez and Mobile regions. There were huge increases in church rolls right after the New Madrid earthquakes. So it affected lots of people in different, well, in kind of similar ways actually in terms of religious conversion. All right, so here's the situation then, right at the point of conflict. The Creeks have been battling each other for several months up in the nation, and we have then increasing concerns among the American settlers in the Natchez area as well as in the Mobile, in the Mobile-Tensaw region, and people begin to ford up, and that's when Fort Mims is built, these real flimsy stockade. It's been excavated over a period of many years now, from the 1960s onwards, and about 5 or 6 years ago I was able to go out and excavate a little bit of the stockade itself, which hadn't actually been identified as such before that point. And the trench for the stockade was only about, if you count the plow zone, maybe 6 inches deep, and maybe there's been some ground compaction, but certainly the posts were set no deeper than a foot. And it's amazing when the Creeks attacked, they didn't just push the stockade over because it was very, very flimsy, which is true of most of these forts, I think. But anyway, there are about 20 of them. There are quite a lot. And here you can see this is the Creek Nation boundary. They kind of line up right along the boundary because these people, these settlers who were really beginning finally in 1810, 1811, 12 to flow into this region, were trying to push up against the boundary, trying to take all the best land they could right up against the edge of the Creek territory, with the idea that someday, as it had happened many times in the past, they knew that eventually they would get to jump over that boundary and claim land on the other side. So they're putting a lot of pressure on the Creeks, and the Creeks, of course, understood that quite well from their perspective as well. So that's kind of the situation right at the point of before the Creek War starts. And can't give it away because it's not part of my topic today, but of course the Battle at Fort Mims actually follows on a little skirmish on Burnt Corn Creek, but the Battle at Fort Mims is really what brings America into the war against the Red Stick Creeks. And here's a little map of Fort Mims. It's in the collections here, really very nice map drawn just after the battle. So the fort was destroyed, but archaeology has shown that the map is pretty accurate. And you can see there were something like 450 people crammed inside this little bit over a 1 acre size fort, very, very crowded. Sorry, I keep doing that. Here's the Federal Road, by the way, leading to Mims Ferry over here, Holly Creek Landing. So, just, I don't know, I shouldn't get into all this. This is the various battles that happened during the Creek War. But back to the Federal Road for one last bit here. One of the things that actually triggered this conflict between the Red Sticks and the rest of the Creek Nation and began to involve the Americans was an incident that happened in 1812 along the Federal Road at a place called Mannix Tavern or Mannix Store, which is very close to modern-day Pintlala. A little community of Pintlala is kind of in here, I think, somewhere, and Mannix Store over here. This is in southern Montgomery County, right near the Lowndes County border. And here it is, the blow up. These are a series of really nice maps drawn by the first Surveyor General in Alabama, Thomas Freeman, back in 1817-18, just after the huge land cession at the end of the Creek War that ceded most of Alabama to the American government finally. And so it's a very early map. It's quite accurate. We were able to take these kind of maps and overlay them onto aerial photos today. And for example, this part of this little county road here, actually right down here, there's a street sign that says Federal Road. So in some cases we get some historical benefit from the fact that some modern roads actually sit right on top of the old road, but it does diverge, in both directions actually here. But anyway, what we were looking for was trying to find some archaeological evidence of these places that we've been reading about in Alabama history for many years, and Mannix Store is one of those. What happened there was a fellow traveling the Federal Road, a guy named Meredith, who was traveling with his family down the road heading toward the Mobile region. And for some reason, we don't know really what happened, but Meredith was murdered by Creeks right near the store. And when he was found, actually, he's still alive and was taken to the store, and he died there. And Manak, the guy that's the store is named for, is part Dutch, part Creek, son of an earlier trader and translator living among the Creeks. And he became very wealthy, like many of his people in similar situations, by running the store along the Federal Road. It was one of the few places travelers could stay for the night, get food and drink and whatever else went on at the tavern. And so he was kind of caught up in this. When the murder occurred, it was, a lot of people blamed him actually among the American government because he was an easy target. He was the one that should have been responsible for the safety of people in that vicinity. But what eventually happened was that the chiefs of the headmen of the Creek Nation ordered the execution of the people who had killed Meredith. And that kind of judicial exercise was not normal for the Creek Nation at that point. They were very much ruled by relatives should avenge the death of any of their relatives by killing either that individual, the murderer, or the relative of the murderer. And they had bypassed all that old legal precedent among the Creeks and decided they would simply send people out from the nation itself and kill these murderers. And that further inflamed the Red Sticks because it was not a traditional way to do things. And Red Sticks were trying to be as traditional as possible at that point. So anyway, important spot. We wanted to find it. So we zoom in on here and we see that in fact the little circle that indicates where the store was back in 1818 or so is sitting around top of where a modern house sits. So Craig Sheldon here and others in this region got in touch with the landowners, the Morrell brothers, and they were very interested. They were quite well aware of this location being the spot where Mannix store was thought to be. And so we organized a little expedition to go do some archaeological testing in that spot to see if we could in fact confirm that was the location. So we rounded up students and volunteers from all over the state, got together for a day, and did our standard metal detecting and shovel testing kind of survey methods. It's a very low impact kind of way to find out whether there's an archaeological site in a spot. And what we found was, did it again. Here's the current houses. And these clusters show where we were looking for artifacts, and the dark spots show where artifacts were found. And the kinds of artifacts are shown up here on the top. These are pieces of Creek Indian pottery and pieces of British pottery from the same period, just right around 1813, 1814. And given what we know about where the Creeks were living, this is the only Creek site, Bannock being part Creek, the only Creek site that should have been in this spot. So we're confident that we in fact have Mannix Tavern. And we've been trying to do that all along the Federal Road, and we'll continue to do that throughout the next few months, looking for various historic sites that really haven't been pursued in recent years, and hopefully be able to make some progress, learning more about that part of Alabama's history. Federal Road's got it's 250 miles long approximately in Alabama. It's a lot of territory to cover, but great history all along it. Just yesterday I was taken out to a place in northern Baldwin County near the Little River that is the house of William Weatherford. I had no idea his house was still standing, but the leader of the attack, one of the leaders of the attack on Fort Mims, somehow rehabilitated himself after the Creek War and was actually living amongst the people he had been fighting a few years earlier. In the Little River area, and he had a nice, impressive house that he built, dog trot style house, and it's still there. So there's all kinds of great things to be found still in Alabama that really haven't been, I don't think, appreciated fully by everybody. This is a little section of road that was studied by a guy named Fletcher Hale back in 1947. He was a county engineer in Monroe County back during World War II. Became very interested in the Federal Road. And this is before much paving had gone on. So he was actually able to go and look around sections of the road that were pretty intact. And in this case, up kind of east of here, he found Fort Hull, one of the Creek War forts. It's an earthwork still standing. There, right nearby, an old, what he called an old log house. It's this little sketch of it up here, kind of a saddlebag, dog trot style log house. These are standard, that's the standard appearance of a tavern at that period. We think that was kind of the norm. And I don't believe that house still exists, but we do have a little sketch of it at least. So plenty of interesting things to still study. Here are little bits and pieces of the Federal Road. Some of you might have visited the Natchez Trace over in Mississippi primarily. And you know, the most famous parts of it are big entrenched sections where people traveled thousands of people traveled on the road, and it actually wore down through the dirt. We're finding bits and pieces of the road like that in Alabama on the federal road as well, which really is exciting to me. This is a nice section to still use as a drive, and it's hard to see here, but this is a big entrenched section in Monroe County. We've seen them as well in Butler County, and probably we'll find them to the east of here, I think more likely than anywhere else. There are still a few taverns around. This Watkins Inn here is still standing. It's a hunting lodge now, or hunting camp, but in great shape, and it's a very early tavern. Not sure about the one up here in Butler County. It may still be around. And here's more bits and pieces of intact portions of the federal road. Catherine Bronze is in the audience here someplace, somewhere. There she is. She and I have just gotten a little grant to do a guidebook to the federal road, so hopefully in a couple of years we will be able to share what we're learning about this neat road, and you can all go, well, you can go travel it now, actually. There are flyers available, but we're going to hopefully add to the awareness of the federal road and all the things to see along it. Another few sections. This is right near Mannix Store on the Montgomery-Lowndes County line. And over in Butler County, ran into all kinds of folks, and Monroe County as well here, who have been very helpful. It's amazing. Everybody, there are hundreds of people out there who know a lot of this information, and they're very anxious to tell others about it. It's an exciting kind of topic for many people here, and we're having a tremendous time meeting these folks and talking with them and learning what we can about it. So that concludes my talk. Thank you. Okay, so the question is about Major Daniel Beasley, the commander at Fort Mims, and whether I think he was responsible for the disaster. I don't think there's any doubt that he was a very inept officer. He was not he was a militia officer. He had no military background. He's most famous, of course, for having left the gate open, allowing the Creeks to rush right into the fort, which is a pretty basic blunder. So I don't think anybody would excuse him for that. And apparently the gate couldn't be closed. You know, there was such lax discipline at the fort that sand or dirt or something had piled up against the gate. It's a very famous story from Albert Pickett's history, you know, that talks about Beasley's responsibility. A lot of people, I think, afterwards, though, in the press, there was a big debate about who was responsible, and Beasley was a good target because he was dead and couldn't fight back. But people were also going after General Claiborne, who was the overall commander of the Mississippi Territorial Militia, and he did take a lot of heat for it, and actually it pretty much killed him, I think. He was very hurt by all the attacks, the political and public attacks against him, who were really blaming him rather than Beasley. So the debate goes way back to the very beginnings, and I think there's plenty of blame to go around. It was the major disaster of American forces fighting Creek Indians up to that point, or any Indians up to that point. And from the other perspective, it was the greatest Indian victory probably of the entire history of Indian wars to that point. It was a remarkable achievement that they could take a fortified settlement like that. There were 100 militia inside. There were about 40 local militia, not territorial militia, and 100 or so other people who had weapons who were fighting off the Red Stick attacks. So it was not simply a walk-in and massacre the inhabitants. It was a long, drawn-out battle, and long after Beasley died, they were still fighting. So it's more of a complicated story than simply blaming Beasley for that. What was the role of the British supplies to the Red Sticks in the beginning in starting the war? Is that your question? Okay.
How much espionage was there?
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of espionage going on. There were at least 5 American spies in Pensacola when the Red Stick Party came down to get supplies prior to the battle at Burnt Corn Creek. The place was overrun with spies, probably more spies than inhabitants in the town. There was it must have been quite something at the time. Well, there were no British directly involved. There was a British trader there who supplied the Creek Red Stick Party with goods. Most of the goods were British manufactured because they were coming out of the Patton and Leslie store there. One of the big supplies, though, besides the gunpowder and lead shot that was the main concern to the Americans, was Liverpool salt, or big bags of salt, all kinds of odd things that the Creeks were running out of because they'd been pretty much embargoed. Once they began this Red Stick movement, Hawkins stopped traffic on the Federal Road, stopped traders from dealing with the Red Sticks, and so really the British in Pensacola were the only option that the Red Sticks had for any of this material that they, even though they were trying to wean themselves off anything having to do with European manufacture or technology, they still were very dependent on weaponry and on simply things like salt for processing food, for storage of food, which was not at all a traditional Creek method of food preparation. So the British were all tangled up in it, but at the time, I think also later on, Albert Pickett, the historian that first really dealt with this issue, tended to blame the whole thing on the British agitators trying to stir up the Creeks against the Americans. Creeks had plenty of reasons to dislike the Americans without need of the British. And in fact, the British were very little help to the Creeks until about a year later when they finally got involved in operations against New Orleans and against Mobile to the south there. Okay, the question is about Three Notch Road and whether that corresponds to the Federal Road. I think in most cases it doesn't, although there are plenty of local names for different segments of the Federal Road. There's Stagecoach Road, Stage Road. There's a lot of different alternative names. It gets very, very confusing the further south we work along the Federal Road because there's just a maze of roads that are very old. But Three Notch Road simply refers to the kind of blazing that Americans often did along roadways. And so they may well have done that along the Federal Road too, but I think in general it refers to other roads. What we're trying to do is work from the earliest information we have and not from the latest, which is probably pretty different than how the road started out back in 1810. I forgot to mention it, but there's a pretty interesting survey done by Lieutenant Luckett out of Fort Stoddard in 1810. He was in charge of a party of axemen, soldiers with axes, who were supposed to widen the Indian path to something that a wagon could travel down. And he was not a very good surveyor, unfortunately. He got lost about 20 miles off the route before he realized he was not on it anymore. So it kind of gives you an idea of how ephemeral this road was. It's very hard to follow it. Also, he seemed to have gotten north and east mixed up routinely, so we're having a terrible time following his directions. He actually gave up at Pintalala Creek and went back home. So. Okay, the question is, do we know where the Battle of Burnt Corn Creek took place, and can we find it archaeologically, I guess you're asking. We'd really like to try to do that. The main clue, well, there's two of them, I guess. When people wrote about the battle right afterwards, just within a few days, they say they took the Federal Road north to Burnt Corn Springs, which is the modern-day little community of burnt corn, and then they followed the Wolf Trail down toward Pensacola. And so we kind of generally know, about where that was. And the battle took place at a crossing where the Wolf Trail crosses Burnt Corn Creek. Well, that narrows it down pretty good to a little section north of Escambia County. And the local people there are pretty convinced that that's the location. In 1895, when Halbert and Ball, the really tremendous historians of the Creek War from that era, tried to locate it themselves, they came to that same conclusion because there was, at that point in 1895, there was still a road crossing the creek at about the same spot, they thought. But nowadays we would expect to find archaeological evidence, and it might be very difficult to find because the battle was really primarily a skirmish, although it went on for a couple hours, but it covered who knows how much territory. It was a running battle for sure. There was no set positions where they fired each other. They were moving around. The Creeks initially retreated, left their pack horses to the Americans, and the Americans then started rummaging through the pack horses, got distracted with looting the stuff, and the Creeks came back and reattacked and chased them away, and then they kind of reestablished some position somewhere else. So we're not at all sure where any of that exactly happened, and we'd like to give it a shot, but I'm not tremendously optimistic we're going to find anything. The battle at the Little Bighorn is really the classic archaeological study of a running fight like that, and it took many, many years for the archaeology to finally be clear enough for historians to reinterpret the course of that battle. And now it's very well known, but that was a huge effort. And so If we figure out Burncorn Creek, we ought to be right up there in the annals of archaeological history, because that would be equally tough, I think, to do. Okay, the question was, what's the involvement of the North Carolina militia in the Creek War? And essentially, they came in fairly late, along with South Carolina militia, and they established some of those forts, Bainbridge and Decatur and Jackson, primarily, leading from the Georgia border to where Fort Selous stood. And they built Fort Jackson on top of Fort Selous. So mostly they were building forts and they were manning them. And I think they then, I'm sure Jim knows this better than I do, but I think they did send out certain detachments to round up other Red Stick groups who were still hiding out in the Cahaba Valley and other locations in the upper Alabama, and try to bring in Red Stick, basically the men and women, well, women and children primarily, who were just starving to death out in the woods at very late in the war, after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and after the construction of Fort Jackson. And they eventually found several thousand Red Sticks and brought them to Fort Jackson and fed them for the summer. So that was, as far as I remember, that's their major involvement. Population of the Upper Creek Nation, or part of the nation, that's a really good question. I would think 8,000 or so. That's just a guess. I haven't researched that recently, but it was maybe 8 to 10. Because there were people coming from the Lower Creek Nation who were Red Stick sympathizers and joining them, so the population was very much in flux at that period. But I think just kind of thinking back on the numbers of rations given out at the various points along where the American Army was feeding refugees, I think that would be a fairly close guess. Probably they lost a couple thousand warriors in various, and other non-combatants as well during various battles. So they had lost quite a few of the population, maybe a quarter of the population by that point.